Hey guys, alright, today we are back with another potential history video. This time we are continuing on with the tank memes. This time we're on to the good old US of A. The American tank meme. America's got a lot of industry, plenty of opportunity to make a bunch of memes. Let's see what kind of memes we are dealing with here today.
Sherman tanks, remembered by their designers for speed and agility, and by their crews for being the right tanks for the wrong war.
Oh. So our main fucking tank was not right for the okay.
Drop it.
So our fucking main tank. What? Oh, I can't wait to hear what's so wrong about the Sherman.
Think of true-to-life models researched by your... So, given my record of what a lot of people expect from me, and what a lot of the more recent
Sherman good, Sherman bad.
conversation about American tanks has been made up of, I'm sure you think you already know what this entire video is going to be about. It started off with the joke about how everybody used to think the Shermans were death traps, and I'm going to go through all the cookie-cutter facts about why the Sherman was actually good. The 3% mortality rate for crews both in and out of the vehicle, due mostly to the incredible ease involved in exiting the Sherman. The fact that German big cats were rare, and that you can only point out a handful of times that any of the big three were encountered. And end it all with a long rant about how the book that shall not be named serves only as a testament to confirmation bias, and that Belton Cooper was the worst author in history. But I think that intro in this paragraph covers about all of that as much as it needs to be. Because it's been talked to death and followed as many sentences beginning with "actually" as anyone can count. The one thing that seems to not really be in any of these discussions, though, is why the US made the design and implementation of their tanks, specifically the M4, in such a way that it sparks so much controversy. Why were they so slow to implement new designs and changes, and why did they stick with the same vehicles for so long when these supposed shortcomings were so self-evident? If the Germans were coming up with a new model pretty much every year, with all the economic shortages they faced, how come these dumb Yanks couldn't push out something other than the Sherman before the war was
Hard to count the Pershing because it showed up so late. You know what? Fair. I'll give that
The
to
US
him.
began its relationship with tanks crewing French FTs in World War I, and created its first one shamelessly ripping it off in the form of the M1917. Various designs were created in the
Plus quite a few prototypes and variations. Yeah.
war era, culminating with a nice stock of M2 mediums at the outbreak of the war. Although this was more of a mobile pillbox than a tank, as the US was currently in the grips of the cult of the machine gun. Tank development as a
Praise be the machine gun.
whole, however, was never given too much attention, as there was a minor stock market incident that plummeted the third
It's one way to put the depression. It's just a minor stock incident, yeah. No big deal. They'll recover.
into the big sad, and most of the military
Oh, the big sad. Oh.
spending went to the Navy.
You know what? That's how I'll always refer to it from now on. It's not the Great Depression no more. It's the big sad.
As war began in Europe, though, the US realized it may be called upon again to sort out Europe's problems, and upon seeing what the Germans had been doing with tanks, realized that they would need a force to counter it, and developments began on the M3 medium tank that was the result of some experiments with a 75mm
T5E2 armed with a 75mm M1A1 pack howitzer in the hull. It was never mass produced.
Freedom launcher on the M2. I'll direct you to this video here in the top right corner for more information on the M3, but it was really a
Oh god, I already forgot everything that was said in meme tanks too. Oops.
stopgap while the long development cycle of the M4 was wrapped up. The M4 Sherman was the tank the US was going to win the war with, featuring a 75mm and a rotating turret, sloped armor,
This model has a welded hull, but this is present on the earlier cast hulls as well.
a decent speed from its radial engine, and it was well received by the troops, serving until the end of the war and even further on into Korea. It was one of only a handful of tanks that served pretty much everywhere. There were also many variants along with the multiple upgrades, albeit they took a while to be implemented, within its career. And although I criticized the Germans for all of their various changes in the production run of their tanks, the massive American industrial base was able to handle these changes incrementally and still pour out the tanks in incredible numbers. Ah, American industry. And it's
This isn't even our final form.
only at a small point throughout its amazing career that people give it a bad name. In France in 1944, and to a larger extent somewhat in Germany towards the end, they got called death traps, because the Germans, who were on the defensive, destroyed a notable number of Shermans with their big penis guns.
Was not expecting that.
And
Okay.
that has created a back and forth of Shermans being death traps, even though when you're on the offensive like the Americans were, you typically want a 3-to-1 average.
3-1 rule of combat states that in order for the attacker to win the battle, his forces should be at least 3 times the force of the defender. 3-1 rule is examined in this paper with respect to the models that correspond to 4 combat situations.
And the defenders have a built-in leg up because they can stay in place, hidden behind cover, and shoot first, meaning they will obviously kill more than the exposed attackers. Something
Yes.
that, goes back to ancient history. Sun Tzu even wrote about it, and it's part of Warfare 101, with the Germans even running into this problem during Barbarossa, when they came across actually prepared Soviet AT guns. But yeah, the whole thing's a death trap because
Oh yeah, you know what? That's a fair point. Good job.
when it ran into an ambush, it didn't magically deflect the shells and throw them back at the enemies who fired them. That's the core of the main issue, that the Shermans were too lightly armed and armored, and that they weren't suited to fight the Gen 3 German tanks that the Allied commanders should have known that they would be coming up against in the later war, and that it took way too long for upgrades to the Sherman, and for the Pershing eventually, to come online and give them a fighting chance. And I will admit that, yes, it took the Americans a long time to get new equipment overseas. Hell, it took them a long time just to get the Sherman overseas, as they had to use the M3 as a stopgap. But why is this the case? The problem certainly wasn't economical. Although the US was just getting out of a Great Depression, the US economy was the biggest in the world. So big that they could sick their economy on their economy to fix the economy.
Stonks.
So that wasn't the issue. But like everyone else, the US did face problems when going to war, and for them it was location. All the ocean between North America and all the fighting, putting thousands upon thousands of miles between its troops overseas and its industrial heart. Now, this was overall a good thing because the war wouldn't really touch North America and its civilians and factories were pretty safe. But what it means is that for everything sent out, it cannot easily be returned home for repair. Basically, all upkeep of soldiers, weapons, and most importantly vehicles has to be basically ready to be done in the field. Where, say, the Germans could send back the Ferdinands to the factory for a complete rework just on the trains, the Americans couldn't do that without it becoming a huge undertaking. So because of that, everything had to be either solidly made or easily repairable in the field or a field depot. And to make that possible, their tanks had to undergo much longer sets of trials to be approved by the armored force that they were going to use. And they had to bring a lot of spare parts. One example of their extreme scrutiny is that, at one point during the Sherman's development, there was a lock washer on the transmission that was going to fail long before any other components would. And it had to be sent back and reworked because even such a small component had to be built up to the standards that they wanted for this thing to run for a long time on foreign soil. The 76mm Sherman was ready in 1942, but it was extremely difficult to fight in and took years of rework for it to finally be approved and allowed to be sent over for fighting, for the ergonomics to get good enough for the troops to use it to its best extent. The Pershing began its development much earlier in the war than people really realize, but the early models were so bad that Armored Force didn't want them, and it took a long time before they were convinced that a suitable model had been created. And if you know anything about the Pershing, it still had quite a few problems. So these issues that people complain about that the High Command wasn't thinking...
Okay, so hold on. I haven't talked in a bit. This doesn't feel much like an American tank meme, as more, correcting the internet and saying that it's a meme and that it's actually not as much of a meme as you say it is. I think what I said made sense.
Far ahead enough and not providing the troops with what they needed isn't true. Oftentimes it was the people who were going to be using the things that said, no, this isn't good enough, we don't want it. And in some cases like D-Day, newer things like 76mm Shermans were available, but commanders on the ground said that their regular Shermans were doing just fine and they didn't see why they would need to retrain their troops on a new tank, which I admit was probably a bit of a mistake. So the genesis of these arguments of the Sherman being a death trap and not being good enough is really out of a misunderstanding of how US R&D worked, and the problems the US faced fighting a war so far from home in a way that is arguably the smartest, not taking gambles on bigger, shinier guns and heavier armor in case the thing is a reliability nightmare. And with the Sherman being as good of a tank as it was, and the points arguing against it being a death trap that I mentioned before, I would say this is easily the right idea. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below what other countries would be good to cover, even though we're kind of running out of majors at this point. And thank you.
That was a good video. That was fantastic. Let's go. What photo? Let's go to the let's go here. Let's have this video with the American star right there on the Sherman. Yeah, I 100% agree. I would say in the past, I have fallen under the belief of the Sherman not being that good of a tank. However, yeah, I agree here that I think, they had to find a balance between what would work well, or work good enough for the war, but also could be shipped overseas in mass numbers, and also not need to be, sent back home to get repaired or whatever, right? And I think the Sherman was perhaps, for the time, the best option, the best that they could come up with. Like, obviously, I mean, American infrastructure around the world and American logistics around the world with the tanks today is just insane. So, like, it would be unfair to really compare them to the modern tank, of course, because also American influence has increased drastically, and what Americans are able to do overseas is a lot different than what the Americans could do back then, especially while fighting a war that is raging all across Europe and Asia. But yeah, I think this was a great video. I think anyone that anyone that makes fun of the Sherman, I'd say send them this video. See what if it changes their mind. I think this would have definitely changed my mind had I been one of those more stalwart, anti-Sherman people. But I've always thought, like, I guess I would say I've always thought of the Sherman just as a tank that just gets mass produced. I always thought of it as just a easy to be made, mass produced tank. So, like, then hearing about how the Germans on the defensive are destroying these Shermans, it's like, yeah, that's expected. Not talking about the whole 3-to-1 rule, not talking about how the defenders always have the advantage, but just based on the knowledge that I had previously of it being, it's a cheaply made, mass-produced tank. So that was the American Tank Meme by Potential History. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.